This morning, I'm not going to talk about the Rebecca and Isaac story because it's pretty self-explanatory. But today's reading gospel from Matthew is difficult. In fact, if any of you were able to figure out what it meant with one hearing, you are a better woman or man than I. First time through in preparation for today, I had no idea. It took me 5 readings to get some idea of what to write about. And the idea was this: Laurie, you've got to back up and read where Matthew was before he arrived at chapter 11 of his telling of the Jesus story. I wasn't going to figure it out just by reading this pericope. For those who are biblical smarties, please excuse me while I attempt to explain what I found in what might make Matthew 11 verses 16 through 19 and 25 through 30 meaningful to listeners of Matthew's time and to today as well. Matthew's gospel must be read as a piece of literature written for its time. That is, the first decade of the first century CE, or the first decade of the second century AD. It wasn't written for the ages after that, although we have appropriated it and find wisdom in it. This version of the good news was written by Matthew to Matthew's church. That church was probably located in either the city of Sepphoris or in Tiberias, which are about 70 to 80 miles north of Jerusalem, if you know Israel. Sepphoris and Tiberias are south of and about 10 to 15 miles from the cities of Bethsaida, Chorazin, and Capernaum. These last 3 towns I mentioned because I will refer to them later. Matthew was writing after the first rebellion of the Jews against the Romans and the subsequent destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem by the troops of the Roman leader Titus. With the destruction of the temple, there was upheaval in the Jewish community and a power struggle among the Jews. The struggle was about who practiced the truest Judaism or the true Jewish law. At this time, the followers of Jesus still considered themselves Jews. They were a sect, and not the only sect, that had a different understanding of the law and the prophets than the Pharisees. The Christian Jews' lens was the teaching and healing ministries of Jesus and his disciples. That is the good news. It was a difficult time for the Christian Jews because the Pharisaic Jews, those had been interpreting the law and considered the experts at it, they had a majority of the Jews supporting them. Christian Jews, though a minority, were strong enough that it was causing disruption. Matthew's version of the good news tells the Jesus story. But it is also Matthew's story because he is teaching his community of Christian Jews to navigate their challenges to continue to be Jesus' followers, no matter the pressures from other Jews in their communities. Matthew speaks to Christian Jews through the voice of Jesus, and Jesus speaks to the Christian Jews through the pen of Matthew. As Jews, Matthew's church understood the tradition of the study of the law and the prophets, but they only too well understood the demands and impositions caused by the enforcement of the minutiae of the old law and the prophets. In contrast, Matthew's church understood the law through Jesus' message and through Matthew's unique telling of that message. In chapter 5 of Matthew, Jesus speaks to the early Christians, and Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill them. Essentially, Jesus is saying that the understanding of the law and the prophets needed some reevaluation. The law and the prophets should guide what the Father meant for his children of any age to follow. But the law and the prophets should have heart too. Matthew's church did not find the minutiae, the nitpicking study and implementation of the law and prophets, to be necessary or fitting for the needs of the time. Jesus has taught a different way. Matthew's church was serving the contemporary need of the community. It saw love and caring and serving the poor, the sick, the despairing as the focus of its ministry and the course adjustment that Jesus had taught. And Matthew's church was a battle to remain alive and relevant within that new perspective. So, having described the context of Matthew's gospel, that is what's going on geopolitically, that is the destruction of the temple, the Roman control, Jews located away from Jerusalem, and theologically, old law and prophets versus Jesus's course direction. We can now look at today's brief piece of Matthew's story and maybe begin to put some meat to its bones. So today's first verses are, "But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn." Then Jesus speaks of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees in his frustration. "John the Baptist neither ate nor drank when he was in the desert. For that, John was labeled a demon by the Pharisaic leaders. But Jesus did eat and drink, and he was labeled a glutton and drunkard, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Nothing seemed to make the Jews happy. They just wanted to interfere with the Christians' way, which wasn't theirs. Nothing would make the Pharisees and their followers respond to the joy and cries heard in the community, in the marketplace. Then in the verses we did not hear this morning, verses 20 to 24, Matthew, speaks to the Jews of the towns of Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum. In Matthew's story, Jesus had taught in these towns. He had healed there. And yet the people there still were not convinced that Jesus' interpretation of the law was the better way. Matthew says that with all that Jesus had done for the people of these towns, and they weren't even Jewish towns, those deeds had been done for the towns of Tyre and Sidon and Sodom, famous for their evil within Hebrew history. Those towns of Hebrew history would have repented for their sinful ways or been saved from the destruction. Jesus had given Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum all he had, but some places and people never see the power of doing good for those wailing right in plain sight in their marketplaces. Then Jesus, through Matthew, says that he is glad his Father in heaven had not shared this wisdom with the learned, that is, the Pharisaic Jews and their followers, but shared it with the newbie disciples, the children. These followers may not be law minutiae savvy, but they would see to those of society that needed help, the mark of a Christian Jew. Then finishing our pericope today is the soothing call to all who are in need. "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burden, Jesus promised he would care for them. He would not demand that they follow every tick of the law, because the law interpreted that way was a yoke around their necks. No, Jesus would make their burden lighter. They would be cared for instead of harassed. I hope you see that this text, written for its time, is appropriate for all times in history. Now too, of course, because the wisdom is still valid, as Jesus, Matthew speak to us. And the message for our time is this: help our world, environmentally, in sickness and in health, in social unrest, in wealthy times, in those not so much. Because of Jesus' teaching, we can say that laws that no longer fit the needs of our world, that are obsolete, need reconsideration. Finding loopholes in the law is unworthy of us who know what is good and just. We must at every time in history be willing to adjust our deeds of power, the miracles we can make happen, to meet the needs of the moment. We cannot know what good we can do unless we try. We must always be doing those deeds of good, even if doing them pinches the toes of those who still cling to the obsolete. May the deeds that we do in the 21st century be the deeds of power for good in our own times, because we are enlightened by the Jesus story penned by Matthew. Amen.